Ukraine has just delivered a powerful blow to one of Russia's most dangerous weapons used against Ukrainian cities. Earlier today, Ukraine's security service reported that underwater drones struck a Kilo-class submarine while it was docked in the port of Novorossiysk. According to Ukrainian officials, the damage was severe enough to effectively put the submarine out of action. This matters because vessels of this class are typically equipped to carry multiple cruise missile launchers, the very weapons Russia has repeatedly used to strike Ukrainian targets far from the front lines. Not long ago, Russia was forced to pull major naval assets out of occupied Crimea after the peninsula turned into a highly vulnerable zone, relocating many of them to Novorossiysk under the assumption that it was safer. That assumption no longer holds. Ukraine has been conducting repeated strikes in and around this port, and each one reinforces a growing reality. Areas Russia once considered secure are now within Ukraine's reach, and that is changing the dynamics of the war. What we are witnessing goes beyond the loss of a single submarine. It points to a deeper problem inside Russia, one that is becoming harder to hide. Ukraine's evolving strategy is stretching Russia's systems in ways they are struggling to manage. As we move through late 2025, three major pressures are tightening at the same time. Logistics are slowing, access to credit is becoming more restricted, and available manpower is steadily thinning. Together, these pressures force Russia into costlier military operations, slower replacement of equipment, and declining combat efficiency. Simply put, Russia is spending more resources while achieving fewer results. Increasingly, the country's rear infrastructure is losing capacity faster than the front lines can consume what remains, and when funding tightens and supply chains begin to stall, the pace of war inevitably slows. This is what the early stages of systemic collapse look like. It is important not to underestimate Russia's size or reach, but size alone does not guarantee security. What is becoming clear is that even a vast country can find itself exposed when a smaller opponent applies pressure in smart, unexpected ways. To understand why this matters, we need to look more closely at what is happening inside Russia and how those internal strains are shaping what we see on the battlefield today. Russia stretches across 11 time zones and spans roughly 9,000 kilometers from end to end. Its economy depends heavily on rail transport, which accounts for the overwhelming majority of freight movement, excluding pipelines. When rail activity contracts, it signals that the unified economy is shrinking, and with it, the war economy. Rail traffic remains one of the clearest indicators of real economic health, and changes there often reveal stresses long before they become visible elsewhere. Freight data tells a far more honest story than official statements ever could because it measures actual tonnage moving through the economy rather than what the government claims on paper. That is precisely why it reveals what is really happening inside Russia today. Even as official messaging continues to talk about growth, the reality underneath shows civilian contraction. From January through September 2025, total freight volume fell by 6.7% year over year. If the military sector were truly compensating for declines elsewhere, overall freight would be rising, not falling. The numbers simply do not support the narrative. The budget impact of this slowdown is immediate and concrete. During the same period in 2024, Russian railways reported a profit of roughly $484 million. 1 year later, that figure flipped to a loss of about $45.5 million, a negative swing of more than $500 million in just 12 months. When a state monopoly loses money, it means less cash flowing into the federal budget, fewer financial buffers, and ultimately fewer options. This is how an economic chart quietly turns into a military problem because scarcity breeds internal conflict, and internal conflict leads to delays. Those delays are already becoming visible at the highest levels. Vladimir Putin removed Sergei Shoigu and replaced him with Andrei Belousov at the Defense Ministry, while high-profile corruption arrests swept through senior defense officials. The result is a system where procurement signatures suddenly carry personal risk and fear translates directly into hesitation. In wartime logistics, delay is poison. At the same time, Russian railways has moved into austerity mode, imposing hiring freezes, unpaid leave, and staff reductions. Fewer workers mean slower operations, less maintenance, and growing bottlenecks that compound over time. This marks the first ticking clock of the conflict because a war without resilient, redundant logistics becomes a war fought in short, costly bursts rather than sustained operations. Pressure on the rail system does not remain confined to infrastructure. It spills into prices, and rising prices quickly become political. Rail stress fuels survival inflation, and survival inflation feeds regime stress. Official inflation is reported at around 8%, but real-world costs suggest it is likely much higher. In 2025 alone, potato prices surged by 73%, while butter prices climbed 35%. When staple goods rise this sharply, the regime faces an unavoidable dilemma: spend more to stabilize households or spend more to keep military units supplied. Either path makes the war more expensive. Social payments begin competing directly with defense spending, while subsidies risk further money printing and even higher inflation. Refusing support, on the other hand, increases public anger and drives up internal security costs. The connection to the battlefield is direct and unavoidable. As the cost of domestic control rises, resources available for war fighting get squeezed. A war economy cannot remain strong if the home front must constantly be bought off. This is why Russia now finds itself in such a difficult position. It is not just running short on money, but losing its ability to use money as a tool of control. Ukraine is actively undermining that leverage by striking targets deep inside Russia with drones, disrupting infrastructure and eroding the sense of safety far from the front. These systems are relatively inexpensive compared to the damage they inflict, delivering outsized returns on investment. Despite Russia's sheer size, Ukraine has found ways to offset that advantage and apply pressure where it hurts most. Recent data makes it increasingly clear that the Russian economy is not recovering from these sustained strikes. And beyond all of this, there is still another critical factor that is beginning to emerge. At the center of all this pressure sits the cost of money itself, and it is quietly suffocating Russia's civilian tax base. The key interest rate peaked in October 2024 at roughly 21%, and while it was later eased by late 2025, it still stands around 16.5%. Once bank spreads are added, most businesses are effectively borrowing at close to 20%. That gap explains why civilian industry has stopped expanding. On a $10 million industrial loan over 10 years, a factory in the United States would pay roughly $3 million in total interest. Under current Russian conditions, that same loan would cost about $14 million in interest alone. This is how tight monetary policy turns into deindustrialization. When civilian profit margins sit between 8 and 12%, borrowing at 20% guarantees losses. Projects are postponed, shifts are cut, and closures follow. The economy splits into two separate realities, one where military production is subsidized and protected, and another where civilian industry is slowly strangled. As the civilian sector shrinks, so does the tax base, and that limitation feeds directly back into how much war Russia can sustain. Tight money also reshapes governments by replacing initiative with fear. Defense Minister Andrei Belousov is squeezing budgets aggressively, trying to force more money into the military while reducing the massive leakage that has historically plagued the system. At the same time, the Federal Security Service enforces discipline through investigations and prosecutions. The result is a climate where hesitation becomes the default. Fear slows decision-making, and in wartime, slow decisions miss critical windows of opportunity. Those missed moments do not just cost money, they cost lives on the front. Once credit turns toxic, labor becomes the next point of failure, and labor is something that cannot be printed or replaced at will. It either exists or it does not. Today, Russia's unemployment rate sits at just 2.4%. That is not strength, it is exhaustion. A healthy economy needs some unemployment, typically around 4 to 5%, to allow firms to hire, adapt, and reallocate workers. At 2.4%, the available labor pool is effectively empty. The war and the civilian economy are now competing for the same people. The military needs infantry, drivers, and mechanics. Defense plants need welders, machinists, and engineers. At the same time, cities still need repair crews, hospitals need staff, and basic services must function. The shortages are no longer theoretical. In December 2025 alone, Russia reported a deficit of 23,000 doctors. By December 25th, the reported shortfall for nurses and paramedics reached 63,000. That is 86,000 missing essential healthcare workers in a country actively fighting a major war. A shrinking workforce becomes a slow-motion battle of constraints. Wounded soldiers cannot be rehabilitated back into the workforce at scale, turning disabled veterans into long-term budget burdens rather than productive labor. A state that cannot effectively heal its wounded also cannot recycle manpower efficiently. And when labor reaches this point of exhaustion, the next thing that begins to fail is infrastructure itself. That strain is now showing up clearly in Russia's infrastructure, which is beginning to fail in very visible ways. During the first weeks of the 2025 to 2026 heating season, Russia recorded 123 major heating accidents. Entire districts without heat in the middle of winter force emergency spending, and emergency spending is expensive at a time when cash is already tight. What makes this even harder is that many of the people who would normally carry out emergency repairs are currently deployed at the front. The result is a system under stress from every direction, where problems pile up faster than they can be fixed. This does not look like a stable situation, and it certainly does not suggest that things are improving. When you look closer at how this is affecting everyday Russians, the picture becomes even darker. In the first half of 2025, new housing loans dropped by 47%, and forecasts suggest that total real estate investment will fall by nearly 40% by the end of the year. When housing activity freezes, the entire supply chain connected to it freezes as well. Construction demand collapses across cement, steel, glass, and related industries. At the same time, regional governments lose property tax revenue and development fees simply disappear. That financial burden increasingly shifts toward Moscow. But even Moscow's reserves are not unlimited. The timing here is critical, because what we are heading toward is a financial cliff in 2026. As the calendar turns, Russia enters a year that will test the system more severely than anything before it. For decades, Russia relied heavily on revenue from oil and gas, but that foundation is cracking. Without reliable buyers, the question becomes painfully simple: where will the money come from? There is no credible plan in place. An increasing number of Russian regions are already effectively insolvent, and the situation is likely to look far worse a year from now if major buyers such as India and China, which have historically accounted for 80 to 85% of Russian oil purchases, continue to step back. If they stop buying, Russia has few alternatives. Even now, it is forced to sell at steep discounts. While the value of its crude continues to slide, revenue shrink not only because prices are lower, but because the costs and risks of moving that oil keep rising. Transporting oil has become a problem in itself. Russia has relied on a so-called shadow fleet to move exports, but that fleet is steadily being degraded. Ships are being seized, damaged, or destroyed, and brokers who once provided vessels are increasingly unwilling to take the risk. When a few ships are lost, the numbers start to matter. Each loss represents a growing percentage of the remaining fleet. And for ship owners, that calculation is sobering. If a single vessel represents your entire livelihood, the risk quickly becomes unacceptable. More and more owners are choosing to walk away, and that further limits Russia's ability to move its oil at scale. What makes this moment especially striking is that Russian leadership is fully aware of how bad the situation has become. They understand how complex and dangerous these trends are, and yet they continue to project calm and control. On the surface, everything is presented as manageable, but underneath, the pressure surrounding and the margin for error is shrinking fast. They continue to behave as if all of this is perfectly normal, but that illusion breaks down when you look at the banking sector, because this is where the next phase of stress becomes impossible to hide. Overdue loans in Russia, defined as unpaid for more than 90 days, have now reached roughly $29 billion. Bad debt is rising because businesses cannot refinance at effective interest rates hovering near 20%. Banks are effectively trapped. They are forced to offer high interest rates to keep deposits from leaving the system, while at the same time carrying large portfolios of older loans that were issued at 8 or 10%. That mismatch leads them every single day. This financial pressure feeds directly into battlefield friction. Procurement chains slow as officials fear becoming the next crutch in case decision-making freezes when every signature carries personal risk. The Federal Securities Service's pressure campaigns turn wartime management into a constant survival calculation. That friction translates into delays, waste, and declining combat effectiveness. Looking ahead, the trajectory is clear. Bad loans will continue to rise while liquidity keeps tightening. The state is moving toward an unavoidable choice between rescuing banks and funding the war. Printing money at scale carries severe currency risks, and this is something the system is clearly unprepared to absorb. What keeps the system afloat for now is a fragile loop. Banks are encouraged by government bonds issued by the same state that ultimately props up those banks. When government-backed banks purchase government-issued debt with state support, the real underlying value becomes questionable. It functions less like a healthy financial market and more like a closed circuit designed to delay failure. That structure cannot sustain itself indefinitely. This is also why withdrawal limits exist, even on personal accounts. Those limits are not about policy preference, they're about fear. The fear of bank runs, and the fear that once confidence breaks, it breaks all at once. As Russia moves into 2026, the warning signs are no longer subtle. The economy is strained, the financial system is fragile, and the buffers that once absorbed shocks are thinning rapidly. Things are already bad, but the direction is unmistakable. The pressures that have been building quietly across logistics, labor, infrastructure, and finance are converging, and when they do, the system will face stresses it has not yet had to endure.